So now we know how to create a form, how to control how and where it's submitted to. We learned about the CSRF token, and we're able to then do different things in one and the same view function and return this redirect if we have a post request, and there also get our data extracted and then do with it whatever we want. Now, before we do more with that data, before we, for example, store it to a database, let's come back to that form handling in general. At the moment, I'm extracting data and I'm printing it. In reality, you typically also want to validate a form. You want to check that what the user entered is valid. Because, for example, at the moment, if I go back to just localhost 8000, if I submit this empty form, so without entering anything here, that still works. I still make it to the thank you page, and here in the terminal we see that nothing was output there for this print statement because entered username is empty because it was submitted in an empty state. Now, we can't fully avoid that users might submit an empty form, but we therefore typically want and should validate it on the server. We want to validate the user input and make sure that, for example, username is not empty. Now, of course, we could add another nested if check for this and check if entered username is equal to an empty string. And if that's the case, we might want to not redirect and not print it, but instead we might want to, in that case, render this review template again. So that for a post request, we do render this again, but we do so because we want to present the same form the user submitted again to the user to allow the user to update his or her choices, to update the data. And for that, we might want to not just render the form like this, but instead maybe with some extra context passed to the template, where we have a has error key, which we set to true. And normally, we might want to set this to false, so that normally for a GET request, we have has error and set this to false. But if we did have a post request but have invalid data, we render the template again with has error set to true. And then we can go to our review HTML template, and here we could then simply check if has error, so if that is true, and then of course also have end if here. And if we have an error, we could show a paragraph where we say, this form is invalid, please enter a valid username. And if we update our form like this, then we added some basic validation, because now we don't use the entered username if it is empty, and we don't redirect to the thank you page. Instead, we return the same form template again, but with this has error flag set to true. And hence now, if we reload and submit an empty form, we now get this form is invalid. And only if I enter something valid, we make it to the thank you page. And validation like this is something which we typically want to add. But it also means that we now have a lot of extra work to do. This is a basic form with just one input field, and I'm only checking for this input field to not be empty. In reality, you might have a longer form with more input fields, and for your input fields, you might also have multiple conditions. For example, that username should not be empty, but also not longer than 100 characters, or something like this. And therefore, you would have to check for all those things in your view here. You have to check for entered username not to be empty, and to have a length that is, for example, smaller than 100. So if it's greater than or equal than 100, you also want to return this. And you also might want to update your form and show different error messages here in your template based on how the validation failed. If it failed because the username was empty or too long, or because you have some other field which is invalid. So all of a sudden, handling a form manually results in a lot of work. And it results in a lot of work, which then typically is the same across all the forms you have in your project, in your different templates. Because for all the forms you might have in different places, you always want to render the form with labels and your different HTML control elements. You then always might want to show error messages if something failed. And you always want to validate your received values based on typically the same rules, maybe just fine-tuned regarding the max length or something like this. And because this is such a common and repetitive task, with Django, you don't have to do that manually. You can do it all manually, as shown in the last lectures and this lecture, but you don't have to. Therefore, let's now dive into the Django form class and how that class helps us construct forms, validate forms, and use form data.